Hey there, folks. Oh, nice to see some of you lined up in here. It has been a long about 10 days since we last did this together. And I'm so glad you're here. I appreciate your being here, waiting on me to get back from my trip. And it was a great trip, by the way. My daughter got married. My oldest daughter, I'd say, but she's actually the second born of my twins. So by 40 minutes. So it was my second born, literally. But one of my twin daughters got married to an amazing man, and wonderful, genuine, beautiful wedding. I've been to a lot of weddings, and I do have bias. Yes, it's my own kid. And I was asked to officiate, so I was officiating the wedding as well. And so I actually got to marry my daughter to her husband. And so that was pretty neat experience for me. And it was all done so genuinely, so from the heart, everything that happened that day, from the comic moments to the fun, the lighthearted, the serious, the passionate, the legal, all of that stuff, everything came off very well. And then, of course, we took the family from Charleston, South Carolina, where they had the wedding, and took a few days, extra days. So we took a little mini vacation and visited some historical places in South Carolina, visited the Serpent Mound, where if you follow my videos, I put up a little video. And this next week, we're going to do 1 or 2 episodes on the Serpent Mounds themselves and the mound builders in America. And I think you'll find some interesting stuff beyond just the plain history as we know it when we start digging into the conspiratorial. And Rocky Stucci is in the house. Good to see you here, Rocky. He says the big cannolis in the house. Well, the emotional meatballs in the house. And Audrey, you're here. Thank you. Love Audrey. Love our Audrey. And Suze, you're here. Charlie, good to see you. And trying to hit all of you here. Nigel, good to see you. Good morning to you, sir. And good to have you here. And we'll just talk a little bit about what I'm going to do tonight. If you saw the header, I'm talking about the funny things that the mind does to you. And I'm drawing on some very deep and personal experience. And it's going to be based on an article that I wrote a long time ago and have updated a couple of times since then for its content. And it was an experience that happened to me, and there's something Rocky and I talked about on his show. Boy, over 10 days ago now. We talked about those things that make you from your past into who you are now. You can either camp there and remain there the rest of your life, or you move on from that. You learn from that. You grow from that. You break chains from that. All that stuff is stuff that we do one way or the other. And the way our mind works will affect the way we do things. And of course, conversely, the way we handle those situations will determine what we do with the things locked up in here. The secrets of the mind, so to speak, exposed in kind of a lighter way tonight. And so, like Rocky was saying, we don't tell stories about our past to get your sympathy. I don't do it for that. I don't tell about the hardships I've gone through to gain sympathy or garner some sort of, oh, poor me's. It's to say, this is where I've been, and this is where I am not now. When I did a lot of tarot reading, some would say, if you're not highbrow like me and say a tarot, somebody tried to call me on the carpet for being highbrow because I've used the word tarot my whole life. I've only known it as the tarot. And I hear people say tarot. You know, when you're saying that, you might say tarot. And so somebody tried to tell me I was being highbrow and insensitive and insincere by saying tarot. It's just the way I learned to say it, folks. It's like the word often. We were taught when I remember in the 5th grade learning that word and being taught that the T is silent. Now, of course, this was 1969, 1970 when I was in the 5th grade, that school year. And back then, some words were different. I was always taught that often is pronounced with the T being silent. It's not often. It's often. Now they've changed that, and it became a highbrow to say often, and now everybody says it. So it's the same thing. It's all about how you learn how to say things. So when I was doing tarot, however, the point I was making is I would run across certain cards that reminded me of things from our past that need overcoming. And as a matter of fact, if I have my briefcase right here, I do. Let me see if I can show you this. Hang on a second. I'm not going away. I'm just stepping away from my desk for a minute to get something. And I'm still talking. Hopefully you can still hear me going on. I'm just grabbing something out of my briefcase that I want to share with you. All right. This is my set of tarot cards that I've had for quite a while, and I've read off of them many times. And maybe sometimes we'll do, you Midwesterners have funny accents. Thanks, Audrey. California, eh? Oh, wait, that's Canadian. What does Californians say? They're like, dude, pal. I had a friend from California when I was, there was a roommate of mine once, and he always had that California boy, type of surfer boy kind of thing going on. Dude. Just looking at the helmet. Oh, yeah, there's Rocky's helmet back there. He's just got to come and claim it. So I'm trying to get this tarot deck open. The reason I'm bringing this up is many times when I would read tarot, I would always tell people somebody's delivering a message to you. It's not me. I'm merely facilitating the message. I'm reading to you what the cards say. And there are a few cards that have messages in them for us, like, well, they all do, but in particular, what I'm talking about leaving things in the past. First of all, this is the Ten of Swords. And Swords was always the card of the anxieties in your life. Swords is the suit of conflict. Conflict you give, conflict you get back. And this is a card of being so overwhelmed by your anxieties about something coming down the path that you create your own problem, because anxieties are really only the things that make the thing worse until it actually happens, and you end up saying, oh, that wasn't so bad. That card I was reminded, there's one in particular. Here, I'm coming close to it, I think. The Two of Swords was another card of conflict. This was a card that spoke to you being indecisive, and you have to break the chain of indecisiveness in your life in order to proceed. There was this one, the Eight of Swords, again, in that suit of conflict. If you look closely, we've talked about this card before. You see the woman is blindfolded, and she's bound around her upper body with these golden cords, but her elbows down are free. And the idea is she's got this path strewn with all this conflict, all these swords. And she's like, oh, I can't see. But all she has to do is bend her arms and pull down the blindfold, and the way becomes clear. Life is strewn with obstacles because we tie on our own blindfolds and then stumble around going, oh, I can't see. What happened to the light? And it's all us. There's one in particular I'm looking for. It's the Five of Cups. And I want to describe that card to you, but I want to show it to you first. It's a card that speaks to things that have happened in our past that hold us up in our present. And I guarantee you, because I'm looking for it in the deck, it's going to be on the bottom. And if I go to the bottom to start looking for it, you know what? It's going to be on the top. So I'll just keep going looking for it here. The Five of Cups is what we're looking for. And the reason I bring that up is because I started talking about what I want to talk about tonight. And that's the things that are part of the secret part of our mind that keep us from moving forward. We continue to put on our own blindfolds. And the way I became most aware of this, repeated over and over and over again, was for all the times I would do readings for people. And these cards would come up, and I'd have to redefine them over and over again to tell people, this is what this means. I'm going to save that one because I want to tell you what that one says too. The Five of Cups in this particular deck shows, here it is, Five of Cups. Now, cups is the suit of your passions, the things that drive you on a passionate level. It could stand for the emotions of a relationship and all of those things. So this right here, it shows that he has 3 cups that are tipped over and spilled and 2 cups that are standing. And the idea with this card was this, and every time I got it for a person, it always fit into the reading to say, you can grieve over the spilled cups in life and be solely focused on those, so myopically focused on the 3 spilled cups that you miss the 2 that are left that are full. And the idea is whenever you lose something or think you've lost something, there's still something that's still there and it's full. And so it's focusing on that. And a good way to do that, one of the major cards of the major arcana was the Magician. And he's the one who draws on all the energies around him to make life what he wants it to be. Because he's the one that chooses all the elements to make life happen. And when shitty things happen and stuff goes on that is unexpected, unplanned, what do? You orchestrate your own life to fit. Sometimes the only reason we're bound up, unable to move, is because of 2 things. We're stuck in some indecisiveness because we're afraid to make the decision, or we're looking to our past and saying that thing has got me held up and I can't move forward, which is bullshit, because we all have the ability to remove our own blindfolds. We all have the ability to move forward. It may not always be a pretty picture. It may not always happen exactly the way we want that to happen, but we all have the ability to do it. And so that's what I'm going to focus on a little bit tonight. And I've got an article that I wrote a long time ago that I'm hailing to, and I'm going to be reading parts of it tonight, but mostly commenting. You know how I do. I like to rabbit trail. Before I do, let me go back in here and see if there's anything I'm missing that we need to talk about. I see Joyce is here. Welcome. And Colleen, nice to have you. And I'm going to see if anybody else, if I've missed anybody. Girl with no name, Spooner. I can't remember what your name is, but I think I've seen you here before. I know I have, as a matter of fact. And all the regulars, thank you for being here. Thank you for the people that are still coming up. Becky, nice to see you. Thanks, Becky. Let me take a sip of coffee because I'm a little dry. By the way, got this mug in Charleston, South Carolina. Little George Washington there, but I like what he says on the backside. He said, guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism. Something George Washington said. So, great mug. It's my new mug. And yes, I do need coffee at this time of night. So, what I want to talk about, it involves something that happened to me as a young boy. Some of you know about some of the things in my past. I'm going to forewarn you that I'm not bringing these things up to get any kind of sympathy or to have anybody think differently of me, but to understand how the brain works and how we can overcome some of those things that are problems for us. The Xena mug is cool. Yes, that's Rainey's, Audrey. The Xena mug and the Hercules mug is mine. And so sweatshirts hide a multitude of iniquity, I always say. So Lola got her shirt. I see no logic. Yes, Lola, you need to send me a photograph of that. I'm starting to collect all the photos and put them up for people to view the shirts. You could also go to Son of a Patriot and leave a comment there, a photo comment. I'm glad you got it. I'm glad you like it. Thank you very much, by the way. Charlie, Captain 11, sir, or Captain 2, sir? Captain I. That's an I. A-Y-E, A-Y-E, I. Aye, sir. Aye, sir, as they said in, when my twin daughters were in vitro, still unborn, I had heard that they recognize Dad's voice when they come out of the womb. So I started talking to them. This is, mind you, this is 28 years ago when they were in the womb still. And the first thing I did, not the first thing I did, when I started talking to them, one of the big things that I did as they were into the third trimester, I started reading to them. And I read them Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. And I did all the voices, you know. I was Long John Silver, and did all the voices that went along with it, and had a great time with it. And every time I started reading, again, this is the power of the brain and the mind. As I was reading and they would hear my voice reading, their activity levels skyrocketed. You could see their feet moving across their mom's stomach underneath the skin, and they'd kick and they'd move all around when Dad's voice. And I've got pictures of my daughters when they were first born, not even an hour old, and they'd look in my face when I would speak to them. So, hey, Topper, nice to have you here. So what I'm going to talk about is a little sensitive in some areas, but it's how we bury the things that are our pains, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. And I mentioned how Rocky and I kind of hit on this lightly a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about this stuff, saying that there are things that happen to us that we don't share because we want to create a sob story, but we share because we want to share the experience of how we moved on from it. You don't camp there, you move on. That's the idea with growth. There are a lot of people who know the things that have happened to them, the things that have caused pains in their life or caused behavioral disorders, if you will. They know where that all starts, but many of them don't leave that spot. And I don't know if it was on this show that I talked about it while doing the book readings, or if it was on Rocky's show. I used, and not to be funny, I did use a Star Trek example. If any of you were fans of Deep Space Nine and Brooks Avery, who played Captain Sisko, before the series started, in the backstory, his wife had been killed in battle. She was also the captain of a starship. And he's grieving over this at the opening of this series. And there's a place where there's some mystical, I don't remember all the things about this show, but some mystical voice that would speak to him, the Guardians or something like that. And it had to do with this race on this planet. And he would, they were trying to get him to understand something, to explain something, this voice. And it says, where, and you might recognize this if we talked about it here. The voice asked him, where do you exist? And he's standing on the bridge of his ship, and he says, I exist here. This is where I am. And the voice said, and then the scene switches, and he's standing on the burning, exploded bridge of his wife's starship where she was captain, and she's lying dead on the floor with other crew members, and everything's burning around him. And the voice said, then why do you exist here? And it did this once or twice for emphasis. And he says, I don't know what you mean. He says, and it switches back to his bridge. I exist here. And the voice says, if you exist here, then why do you exist here? And it brings him back to the death of his wife. And so this is the kind of thing that Rocky and I talked about, and that I want to talk about tonight, is you may look at your own life and say, I exist here. But then you should really ask the question, or the question's being asked of you, then why do you exist back there? Where this thing took place, these things, whatever it is you deal with. And so I thought this was an appropriate night to go into this. And so I've got an article here in front of me, and you can actually see this article. It's on my academia.edu site. You can go to my website, scottallenroberts.com, click on the link Articles on my top menu. And in the articles, it's the article entitled "Oh Captain, My Captain." And I originally wrote this article for a men's group that I was leading in church when I was in church work. And we're talking over 20 years ago now. This is back in 1994, 95. I wrote this article. And this article I wrote with a very religious point of view, a biblical point of view, because these were the guys I was ministering to and working with guys that were in troubled marriages, broken relationships, things like that. And so I wrote this article to them about being dads and being fathers. So it had a very pointed religious take to it. Now I have modified that. I've tried to take the overt religiousness out of it, if you will, and turn it into an article that's a little less religious and a little more factual, pointing to facts, as opposed to trying to make a point in a church ministry group. And so that's where this article got its start. And it goes like this. I'll just start reading it, and I'm going to comment on this. When I was a kid, I didn't think very much about the kind of dad I would someday become. I was too busy daydreaming and doing the stuff that young boys do in their prepubescent years to think about such distant things. My own father was an unknown, faceless stranger whom I'd only met one afternoon when I was 16, but never really got to know until I turned 30 and was about to be a father for the first time myself. Now, I got to tell you here, my dad and my mom divorced when I was a little kid, like a year and a half old. Never knew him, never grew up with him. I also learned that's just his personality once I got to know him. He's a typical guy. Now, he never had any other kids than my brother and I. And he married again like 55 years ago and has been married ever since. And he's now 80 years old. And we were actually going to go visit him. He lives about 25 miles from the Serpent Mountains, where we went to visit in Ohio this last week. And both he and his wife, and you're talking, he's 80 and she's in her mid to upper 70s. They both got the flu. They didn't want to pass it on to the kids. They were pretty upset about it, so we couldn't go over and visit them. And he's having a tough time recovering. And so I got left there, so we didn't get to see him again. But this is the dad I did not grow up with. And I'll share a little story with you here. That when I was going to go, I met him one day when I was 16. When I was 16, you're still a kid. You're not thinking the way you do as an adult. And I was overwhelmed by all the different relatives we met on that trip out to Ohio from Minneapolis. And I remember when I was turning 30, and my wife at the time was pregnant with my twin daughters, and I was going to go see my dad. I said, I'll be damned if my dad doesn't know who my kids are. And I called him up and said, I want to come and visit. And so my wife and I at the time, we went out to visit. And in the interim in there, I had this dream of him. And, you know, I'm not even so sure anymore if it was at that time I had this dream. It might have been later. But I had a dream where I saw this sloped hillside, kind of stretched out in front of me. And I couldn't really see much of the sky, but you could tell the sun was shining. But I was walking through a grove of trees. They could have been apple trees. They could have been cherry trees. I don't know what. But pink blossoming, white and pink blossoming. The whole thing was very bright and light and white, and with these pinkish shades of the blossoms on the trees. And I was walking through there, and sitting way at the end under a tree was my father. And he was dressed the same way I remember him from his high school pictures when he was in the 50s. He had on jeans, black boots, white T-shirt, with the hair slicked back in the DA, and a pack of cigarettes rolled up under the cuff. And I remember seeing a picture of him like that. And so as I'm walking down this slanted hillside, and the whole canopy over me are these very low fruit trees that are all budding. in whites and pinks. And I ended up over by him. We didn't say any words. And the next thing I remember in the dream was I was just sitting next to him, and I put my head in his lap, and he was just stroking my hair. And it was one of those beautiful moments that you see dads do with their little kids. And then I woke up. And so there are these hidden things that our mind hangs on to, and that was one of them. The fact that I didn't have a dad, the fact that I wanted to know him by not having a dad. I mean, not having him present in the home, never having had any communication with him. And my brain hung on to that as I grew up, that I wanted to know who this man was. He was a nameless, faceless person. And so I take a little bit of that and I put that in that category of the things, that this neural net that we build up, these things we build up in our minds, not consciously looking to build up bad memories, but that we, by thinking of them, build up this stronger and stronger net every time we reinforce that by giving it energy, by thinking about it. And so that was one thing. Now, going on in this article, I said, I was the middle child of three, a so-called latchkey kid whose young, attractive single mom worked as a waitress for meager pay and a few lousy tips. She'd head to her job at a small dive of a pub every day before I got home from school, leaving instructions to throw frozen pot pies in the oven for supper, and for me and my siblings to be in bed by 9 p.m. She had a few boyfriend relationships in and out of the home during those years, but none of them ever became a permanent fixture. Consequently, I created in my own mind a masculine patriarch composed of the figures of fatherhood and masculinity that television of the late 1960s and the early 1970s had to offer. I soaked all these characters up like a sponge. You know, when I gotta say this here. I have to say this here. I've been divorced twice. I've been married. Rainey is my third wife. I was married in the early 80s when I was in seminary. We were married for 5 or 6 years, no children. And she left the marriage, wanted something different. And no, I'm not saying anything negative about this, but I've come to learn I didn't talk to her for almost 20 years. And I got a phone call from her out of the blue. This has to be in 2007. And we were divorced in 88. So she called me in 2007, 19 years later. And she said, I'll bet you don't know who this is. And I recognized her voice even after all those years. I said, I'll bet you I do. And she said, I just called to make amends. She said, I went through alcoholism treatment. And for 7 years, I've been holding off calling you. She said, it was the hardest thing to do was to pick up the phone and call you, but here I am. And she's a very bright, intelligent person. And she said, I just called to tell you I apologize for all the crap I put you through and blah, 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 blah. And also, she told me at that time that she was a lesbian. She's been married for 7 or 8 years at that time to her wife. And I said, all I had to do was, I said, stop. I said, I'm just going to ask her, are you happy? And she said, I am. And I said, then everything's fine. And we got to talk, and we talked for a couple hours on the phone, and Rainey was there, and she totally clicked into it. And we invited her and her spouse out to our place for our first anniversary, things like that. So we mended things back then. So I was married once, and then I was married to Annette, the mother of my children, my first 3 children, Abby, Bryn, and Sam. And we were divorced after 12 years because of many, 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 many copious and painful reasons. Suffice it to say, as a guy will say, that my personal opinion of the woman is that she is degrading mentally. You would look at her and say she's cosmopolitan, she's smart, she dresses great, she's pretty, all of those things, but at the same time was somebody who did everything she could to destroy our family. And I was given sole custody of my 3 children, Abby, Bryn, and my infant son, Sam. That tells you what the judge thought of the situation. And so they grew up with me. And when I met Rainey, I was a single dad, single custodial dad of 3 kids. So all these things, I started looking even at those times. What are the things I'm supposed to have been prepared for in life out of the things that happened bad to me or the things I didn't like? One thing about not having a dad around, yeah, I love wedding cake, all right. And one thing that not having a dad formed in me was the desire to tell my kids I will never be an absentee father. I will always be here. And of course, with natural limitations. If I die, I won't be. But the idea is I'm here. And I vowed I would always be a dad to my children. And the same with my 3 children with Rainey. So all of that, I'm giving a lot of personal history. I said this is going to be a very personal show. Well, let me move on here in this. During my childhood, the afternoons I spent precariously balancing my time in the sunshine or out playing in the yard with the dimly lit basement of my mother's home, watching television. I was a TV kid. And every day for several hours a day, I absorbed the varied heroes of television, the sheriffs, the outlaws, the adventurers, the secret agents in such shows as Robin Hood, The Wild Wild West, Lost in Space, Gunsmoke. And there was one thing about all of those shows, they all had a strong male character. They were the manly icons that constructed my view of masculinity. The varied fictional elements that comprised the amalgamated yet imaginary surrogate father of my youth. But out of all of them, there was only one hero who stood head and shoulders above the rest. And Audrey, you're going to know who this is before I even say it. There was no other televised character could compare with the fictional leader who, to me, in my childhood, represented an image of what I wanted to become as a man. He was an escape from the emotional turmoil of my youth, and he was designed by his creator to be the Horatio Hornblower of outer space. And if you don't know who Horatio Hornblower is, we'll do a show on that one of these days. The adventurer's adventurer, the hero's hero, the leader, the visionary, the intellectual man's man were all embodied in Captain James T. Kirk of the Starship Enterprise, who single-handedly established for me the image of what I wanted to become and what I believed a man was really supposed to be. So this is who this was for me. And yes, Michelle, you knew that already too. James Tiberius Kirk. So what I did, I'm going to get into the reasons for this and talk about the way our minds work. He became, for me, the hero's hero. All these iconic figures of 1950s, 60s, and 70s television that were all, we saw in either repeats, very few first runs, but the whole lineup in the afternoons, it was like Gilligan's Island. It was like, then you watch Lost in Space, and then The Wild Wild West, then Hogan's Heroes, and then Star Trek came on. All of these shows were perpetually playing in front of us. And so, Charlie, you said you loved Star Trek growing up, and Battlestar Galactica, the original series. Space 1999. I got into Space 1999 a lot more than I got into Galactica when I was a kid. We're talking about the original series on these. So there was something very different about the Good Captain that struck a chord of harmony with that little boy back in the late 1960s. And it wasn't until recent years that I was able to uncover the buried emotions of my past and to discover why, as a young boy, I found a kindred spirit, if you will, with this fictitious space-age adventurer. Now, for the record, I must state that while I adhere to the tenets of good psychology, I have a sincere loathing of much of the psychobabbly gobbledygook associated with the more non-scientific facet of the craft. And quite frankly, as a guy, I'm not always comfortable revealing the deeper, darker side of my emotional makeup. I can talk a good talk about emotions, but feelings are those elusive things difficult to articulate. So if in this little exercise I delve into either of those areas too deeply for your comfort zone, you have to extend me a little grace, a little latitude, by accepting the things you can and leaving for another time that which you don't, which you cannot accept. As most of you know, and many times thanks to Rocky for letting you know all the things that make me cry, I am a sap. I will cry usually at the drop of a hat. There are things that make me cry, though, certain things of the deeper heart, matters of patriotism, of history, of knowing and understanding what certain people did for us. I watched with my young son the other night, because we talked about it as we were driving through South Carolina and visiting historical sites. We watched The Patriot with Mel Gibson the other night. And the reason we were talking about it was because that movie, the story took place in South Carolina, as well as the entire movie being shot on location there. And so we got to talking about it on the trip, and then we watched it. And there were scenes in that movie that just reduced me to tears, and still do, even though I've seen that movie a dozen times. Things like, him losing his sons, things like that. And I remember my older boy, Sam, he saw it when he was about the same age Flynn is now. And I remember I was putting him to bed after that, and he said to me something like, "Freedom isn't free, Dad, is it?" And I was very taken aback that my 9-year-old son could articulate something like that. And I still to this day don't know if he heard it somewhere else or had heard me say it. And I said, "You're right, son, freedom isn't free. Look at the things he lost." This fictional character based on a real guy. So that is some of the things I'm talking about when I say I can be emotional about this stuff and talk about emotional things. At the same time, I don't want it to be taken as being maudlin or overtly filled with ethos and pathos. That's not what I'm after. I'm after examining some of these things. So let's move on. As I was growing up, I buried myself in the lore of Star Trek. I idolized its main character, as we already talked about. I mimicked his mannerisms, his persona, Spock. You are on very shaky ground with me if you ever criticize the good captain or his show in my presence or to my face. There was a need for escape during those formative years of my life, and I have since learned that I used my affinity with Kirk as a means of burying the things that were too painful for me to deal with. And I put them in a figurative tin can. There were things I couldn't deal with in the open. And in a very figurative sense, I took my childhood pains and buried them in a metaphoric tin can somewhere out there in my backyard. And now as an adult man, now mind you, when I wrote this, it was almost 25 years ago. I said, as an adult man now, searching for the source of buried anger, hidden pain, modes of operation, I've stepped out into that old backyard in the misty dark of midnight with nothing but a flashlight, a shovel, and the tattered pieces of an old hand-drawn map sketched out so many years ago, saying X marks the spot, this way to the buried treasure. That's barely legible anymore in the folds of its age. Captain Kirk, to me, was a lonely man. Sure, he had friends, he had advisors, and a great many lovers. Lovers. What was Eddie Murphy said? He fucked that green bitch. So, make light of it. But at his core, when you stripped away all the facades of his position, now mind you, we're talking about a fictional character here, but most fictional characters are based on the real emotions of the people who create them. When you stripped away all the facades of his position, he was a man alone. The pains and mistakes of his past molded him into the person he was. His inner pain drove him to singularity, and he conquered his demons by cheating them and scrapping his way into the light. I sometimes wonder what it was that William Shatner himself drew upon in molding that character the way he did. How much of him was Kirk? I had a great many demons at that time in my life that needed eradication and exorcism. Not literal. I'm not talking literal. I'm talking figurative here. And though I had no understanding or knowledge of the language or techniques of psychology, I found an ally in the starship captain when I effectively buried him in the things with which I was unable to cope. Now, this is where I want to talk about the brain and what we do as coping mechanisms for things that happen to us. I hail to Rocky because we've talked about these things. We've talked about them on the show. Rocky, I would ask you, what are the things that when you went through your troubles and your pains and your growing pains in life, what were the things you did to cope with the things you didn't do, the things you should have done, the things that perhaps were too painful for you at the time and you buried them in something else? You've been open about drug addiction and things like that. Those are coping mechanisms for many people. I would dare say I would step out on a branch and say there are very few people who have their shit together and are smart about their life and know where they're going and who they are and have a handle on things that hail back to drugs to get them through the day. So you have your own things. I'm making some assumptions there. Every one of you out there, Jeannie, John, Lola, Audrey, Suze, Charlie, all of us out there, we've all got our stuff. And if we look back to our pasts, we could probably identify the things that went wrong to us, because there ain't a one of us that doesn't have something. And we can all look to and identify the things we did to bury those things. And this is what I said earlier in the article, was when I said I could express emotion, but getting in touch with feelings was very rough. I remember I was in marriage counseling with my ex-wife, the mother of my oldest 3 children. And she would ask me questions and I could emote. And she said, "That's great, you're emoting. That's fine. I'm asking you something different." She said, "How does what she just did or what happened, how does that make you feel?" And I go blank. I feel sad. She said, "Is that what you feel? You're asking me a question." And so getting in touch with feelings about things was a tough point. And the way I overcame a lot of things was having to force myself to get in touch with certain things inside me so I could leave them alone and walk away from them. Not that I forget them and never hail to them. It's that I no longer use those things to make excuses for my life or to not do things I should be doing, or to go, "Oh, I did that because I'm a drug addict, I'm a drug addict, yeah, and that's why I beat my wife and children, and that's why I steal money from people, but I'm a drug addict. Have pity on me." That in essence, that's what a lot of people do in all different kinds of circumstances. And so the brain, we sometimes lock things away, and because we don't want to deal with them. Other times we lock them away because we don't know how to cope with them. Many times with kids. That was it. And yeah, John, I recognize that fight you're talking about. I had my little sister who liked Little House on the Prairie and other shows like that too. And I'm like, "Oh, please, not Laura Ingalls Wilder again. Captain Kirk is going to Talos 4. I've got to see that. Omicron Ceti 5. I've got to see that again for the 79th time." So, I recognize that fight. So going on with this article, at the tender age of 6, remember, I'm talking about coping. Now here, I'm going to get into some stuff. Many of you know this about me, or some of you do. And I don't say this for any other reason than to talk about the things Rocky and I talk about when we say there are bad things that happen and you either live in them or you let them go. Like Captain Sisko standing on the burning bridge where his wife died, being told, if you exist there, why are you existing here? At the tender age of 6, my older brother and I were repeatedly sexually abused by a male babysitter, the older brother of a childhood friend. His name was Clement. I know his last name. I know everything about this guy up to a certain point. And he was supposed to keep watch over us while my mom, our single mother, was away working as a waitress. So we'd get off the bus from school. He would be there to watch us until my mom got home from work. And knowledge of these goings on, the sexual impropriety, the sexual abuse, were kept very secret. My brother and I, under threat from Clement, never said anything of the incidents to our mother. The sexual abuse, along with years of physical abuse, became the stuff of hidden baggage much later in my life. Mind you, I was saying, listen to hidden baggage. Things I had hidden either volitionally or things I didn't know I had hidden, the way the brain works, to cope with things. The subconscious anger and rage at being controlled and the fear of being abandoned that manifested in me as a child found a deep, secure burial when I discovered in Captain Kirk a father, quote unquote, who would take away the pain. This is how the little kid responded. There weren't conscious cognitive actions on my part to do this, but rather the natural subconscious survival techniques of a mind too young to know how to deal with what went wrong. And this is what so many of us do. We take those harms and those hurts and those things that happen to us, and we bury them. And if we leave them buried our whole lives, they have a very negative effect on us, because you have to dig those up eventually and deal with them. I have a very dear friend, Rocky knows who I'm talking about, who has stuff that is so buried in him that he has not dealt with his whole life, that they control certain aspects of his life. And I don't think he realizes it. And so this is what happens. And yet there are those times too where we have options provided to us. And by provided, I mean opportunities that come up. Call it God, call it your spirit guides, call it the universe, call it whatever you'd like. We're offered ways to cope with things that sometimes would absolutely crush you when you're younger. And so for me, we tease and we joke around about it a lot, and I don't want it to be a sore spot ever as we joke around about it in the future. But Star Trek for me and Captain Kirk became the things I literally buried the core of bad stuff that had happened to me. I never forgot those things. I just buried them. I let this stuff overcompensate. My brother, on the other hand, turned to machismo, for lack of a better word. He had to be tough, all the time. He went into the Marine Corps. And I followed him into the Marine Corps a few years later. But that's how he dealt with his pain. I turned to religion and went into ministry. My brother turned to violence, albeit legitimate violence, by becoming a soldier. And all along in my younger years, I had Kirk was the coping mechanism for me, the thing that I used to bury the pains I was not old enough to understand how to use. This is what I'm talking about, the secret techniques of the brain that are bred into us that help us do things. The problem we run into is when we never cope with them. and we leave them buried in those things. So going on, the memories of the abuse never left me, but because I buried those feelings, those memories faded from full, vibrant color to black and white with a few shades of gray. And when I reached the age of adulthood, maturity, if you will, I could recount the memories of the abuse, but could never get in touch with how it actually affected me on the inside. And quite frankly, I was oblivious to the damage that had been done. I often sit back and wonder, what kind of person would I be if I hadn't had the things happen to me that I had happen to me? Because those things happen, and then instantly I had to click in. My brain, my subconscious clicked into survival mode, to cover up mode in a way, to coping mode. And they only came out as I got older. Things like, because of the sexual abuse, I learned much later in life, in my mid-30s, that one of the classic outcomes of somebody who's been abused sexually is that they become very neat people, in the sense that everything's got to be just so organized. Doesn't mean they can't have messes around them, but it does mean that the messes around them could get hold of their emotions one day and yank the shit out of them. And they'll go absolutely berserk because they need to be clean. They need to be neatniks, neat freaks, white glovers. And I find that I was this way a lot growing up. There are also people who get themselves so busy that by the time they are done being busy for the day, they're only done because they drop for the day. They're done. They're exhausted. And they do this. I once had somebody ask me, I think it was an old pastor friend of mine. He says, "Why do you keep running?" So what are you talking about? He says, "I watch your life, Scotty." He says, "Why are you running so much? What are you running from?" And it was very profound to me because I hadn't realized I was doing that. He says, "I watch you do this and this and this and this and this and this. All these things you stack up." He says, "You're not slowing down." And one thing I found was that I knew if I slowed down, I didn't know this until this was all brought to the surface. I knew if I slowed down, all that would catch up to me. It was subconscious. And that if that caught up to me, I'd break. And so I kept moving. These were the coping mechanisms again. Those things that we do to make things work. So, in a very real sense, Kirk was the key to unraveling the mystery of my personal buried past. As I grew older, I grew less and less enchanted with the fantasy of Star Trek and its characters, and more into the mechanics of how a program like that was created and developed. I found that as I matured, and in all earnestness sought to reconcile my past and dig for the missing pieces, that Kirk became less and less of a necessity. I realize this now, but back then, I had no clue of what was happening. The understanding has only come in the retrospect. And as I begin to learn more about myself and how to cope with the pain of the past, the captain simultaneously becomes less of a hero figure and more of what he actually was, a fictional television character that I admired. As I learned to deal with my past, he became less important. In a sense, Captain Kirk held my pains until I was able to handle it myself. And it's funny how the mind works. These are those strange, not ununderstandable, because we understand a bit more how the brain works these days. But it works these ways to protect us. It's built in, it's mechanisms. And I would encourage you to look at the things you know are the pains in your life. Don't ignore them. Don't I don't want to go there. I don't want to talk about that. You have to talk about that with no one else, at least yourself. You have to talk about those things with yourself and work them through. And if you ever find yourself blaming your past for who you are now, you know that you've got work to do. Because blaming the past is leaving the past and leaving yourself there. Where do you exist? I exist here. Well, if you exist here, why do you exist back there? That's the lesson that the mind brings us through. As I began to learn to cope with I already read that. As I became a young man, I had no clue as to the nature of my buried issues. And it wasn't until I hit my early 30s that a lot of this stuff even started to surface. By that time, Kirk had long since passed into the realm of childhood hero, replaced with a fondness that attached itself to the memory of how much I had idolized him as a kid and respected the actor who created him. And I'm convinced it's because he carried my pains in a very figurative, mental, psychological sense. And there's something else even to this that, no, I think I'll get into this as I read it. Because I was going to say here, there's even more than this. This isn't where this story ends. When I was in my mid-30s, well, I think I'll stay here because this happened when I was in my late 20s. Do you all remember the movie Field of Dreams, which was a very good movie, and maybe stereotypically good to men who were dealing with their own father issues. And I remember I went to see that movie in the movie theater with my girlfriend at the time, the mother of my first 3 kids. And I started weeping through the end of that movie. And it started especially when the big reveal. Now, if you haven't seen this, folks, the movie, spoiler alert, if you build it, he will come. His father, who had died. And so he's at the end, he said his father was always gone. It was always this, it was always that. Never had a relationship with his father. His father died. And at the end of this movie, he's built this ball field in his cornfield. And it's all so his father could come and visit him from beyond. And at the end of that movie, when he looks at his dad, he has some words with the ghost of his dad. Very emotional scene. Quiet and emotional. And his dad turns to leave and to recede back into that cornfield. Kevin Costner, the main character in the show, calls out and he says, "Dad!" And his dad turns, he says, "Do you want to play catch?" And his dad, "Yeah." And the movie closes, of course, with them playing catch. The baseball. It started out, Nigel, as "They will come." If you build it, they will come. And then by the end there, if you notice, at the end, toward the end of that, it was, "If you build it, he will come." And so I remember watching that movie with my then girlfriend and just losing it in the theater. I left that theater walking with my face just puffed up and red and still crying. And I think she thought, what have I gotten myself into here with this guy? And I didn't even know how to explain it all at the time. But I bring that up to say that there are things that trigger us into remembering. There are things that trigger us into needing to dig a little deeper. When I was in my mid-30s, I started seeing a therapist as a result of a marriage that was falling apart, my second marriage. I wanted to find out what was really making me tick, because it seemed as if not all the puzzle pieces were on the table. I thought I was a good guy, folks. I thought I was this great, loving guy. And I couldn't figure out why. Now I was on my second marriage falling apart. And so I wanted to figure it out. In one particular session with this particular therapist, she offered up this, what was then this new technique that she was using that involved a sort of mild waking hypnosis. There's a word for it, and I don't know what it is. It's become fairly commonplace now. But she held a pencil in the air between us, like you were sitting and I would be the therapist, and she would just move the pencil up and down. I can't remember how she wagged it, but she would move it up and down, and she told me to just focus on the pencil. And she said, "I'm not putting you under or anything like that," but she held the pencil in the air between us and moved it from side to side. And as she did this, she asked me to focus on any picture that came into my mind. She said, "Doesn't matter to me what it is, just whatever comes to your mind first." And she said not to relive any experience or to re-experience anything bad, but to observe the memory as if it were being projected on a movie screen or passing by my eyes outside the window of an imaginary train on which I was a passenger. She made no suggestion as to what I should be thinking about. She merely asked me to concentrate on the first image that entered my mind. And I don't know why, but the first image that popped into my mind's eye was a rather disturbing, and this is a very disturbing experience. Maybe even for some of you. I don't want to say kids. I doubt any of your kids are listening. But it's a disturbing experience. As if sexual abuse isn't disturbing enough. I don't know why, but the first image that popped into my head was this disturbing experience that took place when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And in this movie playing back in my head, I saw a memory in which my brother and I were cowering on our knees on the kitchen floor where we were being severely beaten with a belt. And this beating was more than a mere disciplinary spanking. It was an outright anger-driven lashing. At the core of the beating was the goal to get one of us to confess whose belt this was that had been found on the kitchen table where it didn't belong. And we both insisted it was the other's because at the time our mother dressed us in identical clothing. It was cheaper to buy two belts that looked the same than to buy two different ones. We both insisted it was the others, and the whipping commenced until one of us would fess up. And I remember we were shrieking in pain and crying wildly at each lash of the belt. By the time the angry lashing subsided, my brother and I were covered from the backs of our necks to our calves with purple, black, and blue welts. The beatings were so severe that during my mom had enrolled us in park board activities in the summer. And so we had swimming lessons we'd go to at the big pool. And the instructors at the park board the next afternoon pulled us aside and made us put on our t-shirts and wear them into the pool so no one else could see the marks left by the beatings. Now, at the time, we didn't understand all this. And of course, also at the time, you're talking the late 1960s when this took place, there were different rules in place. If we had gone to a public park board meeting now with those kinds of welts, I mean, literally, they ran all from our necks all the way down to our legs. We'd have been taken away from our family. And so I looked at my therapist when she's doing this pencil thing, and that's what came to my mind. And I mumbled something like, "Shit, I don't know where that image came from." And she very calmly told me to simply go with that incident and continue to move the pencil back and forth. She was asking me to concentrate on that image, tell me anything else that came to my mind. She was not leading me in any direction. She just said, "Go with it. Tell me what happens next." And What I saw next made me chuckle in discomfort. And I wondered if I was simply conjuring up images out of my head that had no bearing on what she was attempting to accomplish. And I kind of laughed. Oh, Jesus, I said, or something like that. She said, "What do you see now?" she asked. She said, "Don't worry if it seems funny or weird. Just go with what you see." What I had seen next was an image of Captain Kirk, going back to the Kirk, burying coping mechanisms and so on, dressed in the green gold Starfleet tunic, the black pants. Mind you, this is the late 60s, right around 1970 maybe that this happened. So picture the course in time. That Kirk from the original television show, in his black trouser, booted uniform, kneeling on the floor next to me while I was being beaten. His arm was up in the air, blocking the blows being administered with the belt, while his other arm was wrapped around my shoulders, holding me in close protection, like this. Now, mind you, I didn't have time to create this image. I was sitting there, and when she asked me to see, what do you see next after just this beating? And that image was instantly there. Here's Kirk, the Kirk that I idolized as a character, sitting like this and with his arm around me. And tell me that isn't something deep and psychological. Once again, the Kirk character is what makes this unique, because he was the one that had become the coping mechanism. I looked at the therapist and I shook my head and again laughed out of discomfort of not knowing why this particular image was coming into my head. She again assured me it was fine and to continue going with the imagery and to continue relating whatever I saw next. Again, not leading me in any direction. The scene in my head morphed from the kitchen floor to the concrete stoop outside the back door of our house, where Captain Kirk sat next to me, his arm around my shoulder, comforting me as I cried. Then the image of a religiously stereotypical Jesus Christ, clad in long white tunic and a red robe, faded into the picture, and he was sitting on my other side, while both he and Kirk enveloped me in the middle, wrapped in their arms around my shoulders as I wept. And then it was all gone. The imagery just faded and totally disappeared. And this is what I was seeing as she was conducting this experiment. So I sat back in my chair in that office, uncomfortably crying in front of the therapist, not understanding what the hell all the imagery was all about and what exactly it had to do with anything I was going through. And it was then that she told me I would not believe, and I tell you guys this, how many men my age had similar sorts of images of Captain Kirk during this sort of therapy. That I think it's astounding, and William Shatner would be probably amazed to know that this character he created, for all practical purposes, became a protectionary character in the minds of so many boys of that era. And so she went on to explain how Kirk was, for me, and apparently many other young boys of my age group, the hero that was more than the hero. Kirk was a sort of psychological savior who boys looked to for strength and a way to cope. He was that adventurer hero that was put on a pedestal by so many. And so what I want to pass on with this is this sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes very interesting way that our brains set these things up for us to protect us. The way we, in my case, no father in the house, wished I'd had a father, grew up without one, who became the surrogate father It was the Kirk, the fictional character. And as a young kid, you can appropriate that. As an adult, that doesn't work so much. You become a weird Walter Mitty. But the mind does this to us. And yeah, you're right, Nigel. Kids don't need to be hit. I have my good friend Dan Madsen, by the way, who sent this article to William Shatner because he knows him. Dan Madsen, who published all the Star Trek magazines, knew all these people. And he was trying to set up a meeting for me with William Shatner, who was totally on board. He said he read the article and he would love to meet me. And I was going to do an interview for my old magazine. And that was about 10 years ago. And it just one thing happened after another. The PR person couldn't get a schedule made, never got back, and we kind of dropped the issue. After a while, we may still try to do it again sometime. And I'll bet you there have been a lot of men, you're right, Michelle, who have mentioned these things to William Shatner. And yeah, Joyce, we're all connected. And yes, Michelle, it is absolutely fascinating. Shane says, I needed to be hit. I promise I was a badass little kid with no respect for authority. I don't equate spanking and hitting. I think they're different things. I just tonight slapped my son Flynn in the face. Now, mind you, I didn't haul off and do one of those. I did one of these and I said, don't you dare use that tone of voice with your mom. I said, you will go walk over and stand in front of her and apologize to her. You do not talk with that kind of disrespect to your mother. And I gave him one of these. And he cried anyway. He cried because he was embarrassed. I embarrassed him. I humiliated him. And he knew he was doing wrong. So I don't hit my kids out of cruelty. I've spanked them. I've used the back scratcher before. You give them 1 or 2 swats on the butt for the little ones. I had heard in child psychology, if you spank your kids, for that faction of child psychology, it doesn't see anything wrong with it. If they're past the age of 5, it's too late. A slap is not a punch. You're right, Nigel. I have no guilt over it. I feel bad because it's my kid. We all heard moms and dads say, this is going to hurt me more than it does you. Well, sometimes it was so cliche, it was bullshit. Other times when you're a parent, you say, that's going to hurt me more than it hurts my kid because I don't like doing things. I don't like taking away privileges. I don't like setting up something with my kids and then withdrawing it because they've done something. How would you say it? They disobey, number one. They don't comply, number two. They mouth off. They bad talk you. And then they talk bad to you. When all that's more than a trifecta, that quinfecta happens, it's usually, hey, that thing we're going to do tomorrow? Gone. And that's usually the thing that's more effective to them. Yeah, kids don't come with instructions. You're right. So, as I wrote about this, I had to ask, and remember, I modified this article from being one that was more pointed to ministry to where it was pointed to more generally. What does all this have to do with being a dad? Which is how I started my article. And so when I was a kid, I had no idea what kind of dad I was going to be. It didn't even enter my mind. And in a very real sense, the fictional character of Captain James T. Kirk became what I believe to be a divinely appointed receptacle for the issues that God knew I was just not able to handle. And as I grew stronger and more able to cope with these issues, that God began releasing the facts. And of course, my view of God has even changed since that article was written, since the modification of the article to say that. That is whether or not you believe that there is an individual, loving, caring, passionate God who, as we taught when I was in ministry, when I was a youth pastor, I would tell kids, I had one kid tell me, he says, I can't pray for forgiveness. God won't forgive me for that. And he said, I've sinned too bad for God. And I remember saying to him, I said, do you think you sinned too bad for God? And I said, do you know that God is just there with arms open wide saying, bring your messes to me? This is what I was taught when I went into ministry. And this is what I taught kids. I said, God, and now I would say if God is there at all, in the respect that we may have been taught, but at the time I would tell these kids, God is there to take you as you are. Flies in the face of a lot of the stuff we study and a lot of the stuff we teach. A lot of the stuff I worked through with Jeff Dougherty, and the things we worked through, I don't think either of us believes there is no God, but we certainly believe it's not the God we were taught existed. And so, and yes, they did teach us how to be better people too. My great quest is still this continual work in progress, as they say. I feel as though I have every day there's a step in the right direction toward the healing and overcoming of my past. Now, again, I wrote that 20 years ago. I think I have overcome it. I think there are still tendrils that hang on in the sense that I still have some of the behaviors of somebody who was sexually abused. I still do. I'm not a controlling person, but I need to control my environment. I have no desire to control other people, but I have a desire to control what happens to me. I have a desire for cleanliness. And I'm not talking white glove again, none of the weirdness. I'm not OCD. But a messy house will drive me absolutely fucking insane. And sometimes I've had to learn to cope with it by just letting it go. I live with 4 other people. My wife, who's not as concerned about some of that stuff as I am, at least not on a psychological level. My 3 kids, definitely not. Hell, if my kids had a clean room, they'd look at it and do the doe in a headlight blink and say, where's all my stuff? It's not all over the place. You know, that's my kids, though. So, I don't camp my life, and none of us should, at the foot of our pasts. And I simply now know where to go looking as a starting point if I ever have a question. I can go, oh, that thing that happened back there, I exist here. I don't exist there. I experienced there. I don't live there. Something else I learned through all these experiences, and this delves deeper into the issue of faith, that God, as my old pastor friend, Parson Larson, John Larson, used to tell me, I remember when I was going through my second divorce from my kid's mom. She disappeared with my children. One weekend when I was away for the weekend visiting, we were supposed to together go visit friends. The last minute she said, why don't you go? I'm going to go hang at my mom's with the kids. You deserve a break. You've been working hard on X, Y, and Z, the things I'd been on. I said, okay, I'll go visit them. So I drove from Minneapolis to Detroit and back. And on my way home, with a 10-hour drive ahead of me, learned that my wife had left me. Now, remind you, this isn't in the days of cell phones. This was 1993. When I got home, all my stuff was gone. My kids were gone. I didn't see them for 4 months. I searched for them. My ex-wife had filed divorce. She was claiming that I abused her physically, that I abused my children. She was even holding up my kids as saying that I had committed, she feared I was committing child porn with my daughters, my twin daughters, because she discovered, quote unquote photographs of my kids while I was gone on this little trip. And all it was pictures that we had both taken of our kids in the bathtub, swimming, running around the house with a bare butt after you took their diaper off, stuff like that. And she used these pictures to try to make a claim that I was abusing her and was sexual misconduct and all this in order to win custody. Now, mind you, we're talking 1993. Again, that's 26 years ago. And 25 years ago, something like that, 94. And I just stuck to it. I remember walking with my pastor. I'd go to the church to talk to him. And we go up and down the main aisle of the sanctuary. Nobody's there. Just talking, our voices echoing. I'd say, why is she doing this? I don't get it. As if she wants a divorce. Why doesn't she just ask for a divorce? Why does she have to make all this shit up? Why is all this? And why am I, and why can't I find my kids? And and there was all these why questions. And I remember at the time that I was still very much in the church at the time. And I flipped open my Bible. I prayed and I said, God, I don't even know what to believe anymore. And I said, I'm going to do what I've heard is stupid to do. And take my Bible and just flip it open and put my finger in wherever it lands. You're going to tell me something. And I flipped it open, and it was the book of James. And it was James chapter 1. And it said this. It said, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the whole thing verbatim. It said, if any of you finds yourself in various trials and tribulations and bad times, it says something about pray to the Father and he'll help you. But don't pray like a wave of the sea that's driven by the wind and tossed, but ask knowingly, confidently. And I don't remember the whole verse. I wish I could, because it was, matter of fact, though, I may look it up. James 1. I'm going to look this up because I want to read this to you. Bible Gateway. And the Passion Translation is not what I'm looking for. If I could, I would shine this up on my screen the way Jeff does. I'm going to see if I can find the Message was the Bible I was using at the time. So I'll read this to you the way I read it. It goes like this. Now, much of my faith issue has changed over the years, as you all know so well. But this is what I opened up to at that time. Consider it a sheer gift, friends, when tests and challenges come at you from all sides. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open and shows its true colors. So don't try to get out of anything prematurely, but let it do its work, so that you become mature and well-developed and not deficient in any way. And if you don't know what you're doing, pray to the Father. He loves to help. You'll get his help and won't be condescended to when you ask for it. Ask boldly, believingly, without a second thought, for people who worry their prayers are like wind-whipped waves. Don't think you're going to get anything from the Master that way, adrift at sea, keeping all your options open. And that's the passage that I read. And the only reason I bring that up is to say this is the despondency I was in at the time. And I didn't know the inner strength I had until I was done with all of that. And by the way, the bottom line of that story was my ex-wife was having an affair. And she was trying any way in the world to cover it up and divorce me. And so she attempted to do all these things. I will tell you this. There's a little more to that story, and since I'm on it, I'll tell you. 4 months had passed. Hadn't seen my ex-wife. Hadn't seen my children. Finally, we go to court where she's accusing me of these things, trying to get a restraining order because of my abuse and my sexual misconduct and so on. And I remember the judge, I got to tell you this story because this is the upshot to the story. Remember I said she had photographs? Back in the day when you took photos and actually had them developed, there was no digital quite yet. And we did duplicates of everything. So I had all these pictures, thousands of pictures of my little kids doing everything. And she chose a few where they were in the bathtub, swimming, kicking around, splashing with toys, and claimed she discovered those and was afraid I was engaging in child porn with my kids, which was all bullshit, by the way. It was her story, her cover story. And one thing that worked in my favor was she had taken those same pictures several months earlier and sent the duplicates to a good friend of ours down in Florida with a handwritten letter and say, oh, hey, so-and-so, I miss you. Here's some pictures of Scotty and me and the kids. Look at these pictures we took of them in the bathtub. It looks like they're doing water ballet. What beautiful children we have. It was the same picture, series of pictures she said she had discovered and made up this cock and bull story. So the judge had these pictures. Our friend down in Florida took those pictures and blew them all up and had them and did an affidavit with the county and had them all seal stamped by the county that she lived in Florida. Sent this letter up for my attorney. And my attorney, of course, turned this all in when we went to court, unbeknownst at the moment to my ex-wife. And the judge did this. The judge walks in. It's a closed courtroom, other than the bailiff, the stenographer, the judge, and our lawyers and my ex-wife and I. And because of the charges against me and the seeking of protection. And the judge walks in and everything's all rise and they say, sit down. The judge has got his head down. He's looking through the paperwork. First thing he said, and I will never forget this to the end of my days. Without looking up, he says, Mrs. Roberts. Then he looks up and he holds up a picture like this. It's of the girl swimming in the bathtub that she was claiming she discovered. He says, if this is child porn, and he goes like this and throws it on the floor in front of the bench. He said, then we're all in a hell of a lot of trouble today. And I glanced over at my ex-wife, still my wife at the time, and she just sinking in her chair. She was turning white. And he said, we're going to fix this problem today. And he said, as for in this temporary phase of this divorce, he says, usually by default, the children go to the mom. That'd be my twin daughters, who were 3 at the time. And he said, today, he says, to make up for a little lost time, he says, which we are remedying today. He says, I don't care what you feel about your husband. He said, they're still his children and he is still their dad. And he gave my kids to me almost full time with visitation to her for the temporary phase of the custody hearings. And if you know anything about that phase, you know, it's usually dad gets them every other weekend and one night a week. And my lawyer just kind of patted my leg under the table and he goes, this is extraordinary. He whispered to me, it's extraordinary. We'll talk when we leave here. And he told me in all his years of practice, he had never seen a judge do anything like that. And then the end of the story is there's a roller coaster here. Not long after that, my pastor, Parson Larson, called me and said, you know, your ex-wife has been staying with the assistant pastor and his wife for a couple of weeks. And she wants to meet with you. And this happened the day after Good Friday. Now, remember, I tell you this only because it's a history. I used to be very into the church. I was working in men's ministries there. I'd worked in youth ministry before that. And as most of you know, I went to seminary and Bible college and all of that. And our church was very up to date and modern about the way they did things. Again, this is 25 years ago. And at Easter time, which if you're a Christian and you go to Christian church, we're celebrating what? The death and resurrection of Jesus. And my church was very big with word pictures. And on Good Friday service, late afternoon, you walked into the sanctuary of the church for the service, and they had a big cross, so big wooden cross, about 12 feet long. And it was laying across the front steps of the altar, the front altar. And they had two little tables at the front, little baskets. The baskets were full of carpenter nails. There were hammers. And at the appropriate time in the service, Parson Larson said, he says, "You wondering what all this is?" He says, "I want you to get a feel for something here." He says, "When you came in the sanctuary, there was a table with papers and pencils. So I want you to take that. Don't put your name on it," he said. And so I want you to write down the sins that you think are too great for God in your life. The things you maybe have never told anybody. The things that you're ashamed of or that you don't feel you can be forgiven for. I said, I want you to write those down. And at the end of this service, he says, I'm going to have you come up here. And what happened at the end of the service, everybody was to take their paper, fold it up, get in line and down the center aisle of the sanctuary, walk up to the cross, take a nail and the hammer, and nail that piece of paper into the cross. The word picture is obvious. It was supposed to be, this is what Christ's act of propitiation, of atonement, and all of this was for. It's, of course, according to the teaching of the church. And it's still very emotional to think about it. What a word picture. You are nailing your sins that you think are too great for God into a cross. And it was all figurative, of course. And so I participated in that, and I did that, and I went and I sat back down, and I saw my wife was in the line. And I thought, she's reconnecting with people here at church. I need to get out of here. So I got up and I left. And it was the next day that the pastor called me and said, your wife's been staying at the assistant pastor's house with he and his wife. And she wants to meet you. So I went over to the house at the appointed time. And she was there, but nobody else was there. If they were there, they were just not meeting me at the door. She answered the door. And I remember my ex-wife, she crumbled to her knees on the floor in front of me and put her arms around my knees and was weeping and begging me to forgive her for what she had done. And I looked at her and I picked her up off the floor by the arms and I said, the forgiveness is already done. I said, what we should focus on is there a next step? And if there is, how do we do it the right way? And I remember saying to somebody, this is the way I was. This was the kind of person I was when I was in ministry. And I said, this is the way I believed. I said, my pastor said, are you considering reconciling with her? And I said, well, look at it this way, John. I said, you teach us. And I learned in seminary that believers in Christ are supposed to emulate Christ. The Bible tells us that. We're supposed to be like him. And I said, we're also taught that you can't lose your salvation for sinning. Because if salvation is a free gift from God because of the act of Christ, in dying and washing away the sins. If I can do nothing to earn that, how can I do anything to get rid of it? I said, so based on that principle, if I'm to emulate Christ, I said, what sin is too great of my wife's, that I'm not to forgive her? And I said, I'm not saying this in a naive way. I'm asking, how many chances do I give? And so he said, I can't argue with your logic. And so my wife and I ended up reconciling. Now it took a few months. We got back together. There was another time where she had become an alcoholic. I'd come home from work at the ad agency and she'd be drunk. The kids be playing games on the floor, my twin 5-year-old daughters. A lot of this, and this went on and on and on and on. And I finally filed papers for the final time. And she begged me not to. And I said, I can't do this anymore. And this is a few years after all the other stuff I told you. And we were divorced. So, and then I went to court and I was given sole custody of my 3 children. By this time, Sam had been born. He was less than a year old. And the judge said he will stay with his mother until such a time as this. He's old enough and he will come to you. Your daughters will go to you right now. So the judge gave me immediate custody of my children. And I had them from the time they were 10 years old until they were 18 and graduating from college. I had all 3 of my children in my home. And then Sam, even when Rainey came on board a few years after. And so all of this to say, that's a story I'm telling. But it came out of this reading. There was something else I learned, and all this stuff with Captain Kirk, with the things we bury, the stuff that's too hard for us to cope with, that you have to believe in some kind of higher power for all of this to make any sort of sense in the religious aspect, this faith aspect, beyond the simple psychology of it all. My quest, as I said, is still a work in progress. I simply know where to look to the starting point. And something else I learned through all of these experiences, and this delves deeper into an issue of faith, the whole God issue, that God is there. And this is where I slipped off into the story there, that God is there for me to dump on. That great someone out there seems to crave my trust and waits with open arms to receive my messes. And the older I get, the more faceless and nameless that God becomes. As I mentioned, there's something I wrote a long time ago. And I think this was on Rocky's show that I mentioned this. Is that God wrestles with man or woman. He wrestles with us in the night times of our lives. But at daybreak, he's gone. That's another nameless, faceless set of strictures and rules to live by and things to assuage ourselves with. I even wrote that. It's right here in the article. God wrestles with us in the night times of our lives, yet at daybreak he's gone. And we're left only with ourselves and our acquired strengths and skills to scramble out of the pit. As a father and a dad, how I started this article, I want to instill in my children a trust in me. I want them to grow up knowing who their father is and that their dad is always available to them. And you know what? I wrote this when my twin daughters were between 3 and 5 years old. And they still to this day, thank God my kids love me and want me around. It's because I made time for them and said I was always going to be there, and I was. I want my kids to know why I bring up this whole God thing. Folks, it's because the first picture our children get of God or a deity is mom and dad. And if they don't see that in us, they're never going to see it in a God, in either an imaginary God or a real God. I want my kids to grow up knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that they can dump on me and bring me their messes and have full faith that I'm there to receive them as they are and hold them up. And as they learn to trust and have faith in me, they'll inevitably learn to trust and have faith in the God they so choose to believe in, if any at all. And after all, in some sense, wasn't it supposed to be God who established fatherhood as a picture of what he ultimately is to mankind? God the Father, and we're his children. A valuable lesson I wanted to point, I learned out of my past is this: dads or moms, as the case may be, are the best portrait of God that children will ever have. Don't let them find that picture in someone else or something else. Don't let anything steal that from them. Be there for them. There's no blame in this statement, but I guarantee you, had we had a dad in the home, I don't think the original abuses would have taken place that took place today, and my brother. I think dads abdicate their authority and they abdicate any rights to their children when they don't want to be there for them. I'm not talking about being divorced. That happens. You can be divorced and still be a parent to your children. Give kids what they are by nature craving. Be there for them and show them a little bit of God. This is what parenting is all about. So I said about this article that it was about the way the brain works. And this is psychology, not even 101. It's like 98.6. It's not quite to 101 yet. This is psychology light. There are things we do to bury our past, things we do to bury our pains, things we do to cope with things as they were. But if we remain there, we exist there. So exist here in the here and now. Be what you need to be for yourself, for your family, for your kids. Trust me. There are things I'd sometimes rather like to be doing than husbanding and dadding. I want to be a pirate. I want to go sail the seven seas. Hi ho away. Put tar on me pigtails and blood on me rapier. Arr. There's things I'd rather do some days. You think I always wanted to be just sitting here? I always wanted to be a dad. But at this point in my life, do you think there's not things I could do that are different? We do the things we do. We stick to it. One of these days, I'm going to have a session. I think women will enjoy this too, talking about the 4 pillars of masculinity. That's something I want to talk about. And we'll get into that too. And so, folks, without continuing to drag it out, if you've got things that you haven't coped with, it's still buried. It's that buried treasure written on the old tattered map in a coffee can buried in the figurative backyard of your life. Sometimes you got to dig those things up. Sometimes you got to face them. The devil card in the deck, I saw it go by as I was showing you the tarot deck earlier. The devil card means face your demons and they will flee from you. So this is what we have to do. Don't exist there. Exist here. Use that to say, I've got a stepping stone to where I need to be. I don't have to camp there anymore. So there you go, folks. A little deeper tonight on a personal level. Maybe a little passionate maybe a little too much ethos for some people. But I want to thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. Go over to my Son of a Patriot site and pick up some of the t-shirts and sweats and stuff that I'm doing. Go to my website, scottallenroberts.com, and see what I do. I'm a graphic designer. I'm an artist. I'm an illustrator. I do all these things for a living. I'm a writer. So I got a ton of stuff to do. I just landed a big project, by the way, that's going to take me the next 2 to 3 months to do. I'm doing a series of graphic novels for writer's novel, Gareth Worthington. My agent represents him as well. So lots going on in that category. So if you ever want to connect on business, you know where to go. If you ever want to just talk to me about anything, feel free anytime. Shoot me a message. My phone number is everywhere. Give me a call. I don't care. Somebody said, how can you put your personal phone number online? My personal phone number has been on all my websites and everybody else's websites that I do business with, it seems, for the last 15 years. So I'm not too worried about it. I've never had but 1 or 2 crank calls. So if you need to call me for anything, feel free. Just don't do it at 2:30 in the morning, although I might be up. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Please spread it around. I'd love to expand this site so that there's more people that come and visit. So I could maybe even eventually monetize this site, meaning they'll play ads on my archives and I'll get to make a little money off of it. That'd be nice. So go ahead and like this video down below if you liked it, and send people over, and we'll see you again, probably not tomorrow night, maybe Sunday night, but Monday night for sure. We'll get back on a regular schedule. I'm on with Rocky at 11 p.m. Sunday night through Thursday night. So any shows that I do this next week will all be at 9 o'clock Central, 10 o'clock Eastern. And that's it, folks. Thanks for coming. I love you all. And remember, it's something that I've realized over the years. With all the shit I know, I realize I don't know shit. And so adjust accordingly in your life. Thanks for hanging out with me. Talk to you again.